initiating development with the knight, preparing to control central squares and foster piece coordination. Echoing white's developing impulse, this knight gracefully occupies a central square, preparing for a versatile game. Preparing to fianchetto, the king's bishop offers a flexible pawn structure, inviting rapid piece development and potential queenside pressure. Asserting central space, too, d5 immediately challenges white's fianchetto setup by claiming key squares. Targeting black's central pawn control, this fianchetto aims for long-term pressure along the diagonal while reinforcing white's kingside. Solidifying the center, black prepares for a robust pawn structure, aiming to contest the e4 square and potentially launch a queenside expansion. Unbalancing the pawn center, this aggressive stride immediately challenges black's central influence and prepares for queenside expansion. Unpinning the knight frees the dark-squared bishop, preparing to contest the d-file and challenging white's central control. Sharpening the central pressure, white cleverly forces black's bishop to reveal its intentions, potentially creating long-term pawn weaknesses. Solidifying the central pawn structure, black gracefully redirects their bishop to a more active square, supporting the pawn advance and preparing for potential queenside play. Solidifying the pawn center with d4 now claims crucial central space, preventing black's d5 pawn from advancing and preparing for potential piece development towards the center. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the central pawn structure, preparing for potential e6 to complete the pawn chain, and offering a safe haven for the knight should white's knight on e5 become problematic. Liberating the knight from the wing, white aims to reroute it towards the critical central squares, perhaps preparing for a kingside pawn advance or a shift to a more active diagonal, while subtly challenging black's control over the d5 pawn. Solidifying the pawn chain's grip on the center is the immediate goal here, preparing to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal and potentially challenge white's knight on a3. Securing the king instantly addresses the most fundamental requirement of chess, establishing a safe haven for the monarch while preparing for the complexities ahead and liberating a rook to participate in the middle game battle. Developing the bishop to its natural long diagonal immediately asserts influence, aiming to challenge white's central control and prepare for potential kingside castling. Opening this central file immediately creates dynamic play, forcing black to decide on pawn structure and potentially freeing up the d8 square for a rook. Liberating the bishop from the diagonal, black recaptures, establishing a solid pawn center and inviting white to commit their knights further into potentially cramped positions. This exchange signals a shift towards piece development and central control, as black aims to solidify their structure before considering more aggressive operations. Reinforcing the knight's central outpost becomes the immediate priority, yet this advance subtly weakens the dark squares around your king. Black's bishop on g7 now eyes this vulnerable diagonal with newfound purpose. Consider how this pawn push might influence future pawn storms or knight maneuvers. Unleashing the queen towards the queenside, this placement immediately contests the central d4 pawn and sets up potential pressure on white's queenside pawn structure should the queenside advance. It's a proactive response, aiming to exploit the current tension and avoid passively defending, hinting at a desire to complicate the game rather than settling for a simple positional exchange. A subtle repositioning, clearing the path for potential future king transfers while simultaneously preparing to contest the f-file should the opportunity arise. This maneuver sacrifices immediate piece activity for long-term structural integrity. A strategic redeployment begins, aiming to bolster the central pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, while simultaneously reinforcing the queen's presence on the queenside. Prying open the center with this pawn thrust boldly challenges black's central control and aims to disrupt their cohesive setup, creating dynamic imbalances for white to exploit. Reclaiming the bishop's scope after the d4 pawn push, this retreat wisely unblocks the dark-squared diagonal, preparing for potential counterplay and avoiding any immediate pawn capture on e4. A bold assertion of central control, this knight hops into a daring outpost, challenging black's queen and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure. White sacrifices a tempo with the knight's retreat to create a dynamic imbalance, forcing black to decide between defending the queen, potentially weakening pawn structure, or finding an active counterplay. The knight's new square offers excellent attacking prospects, potentially eyeing the f6 square or supporting a pawn push. This aggressive maneuvering hints at a desire to break free from black's solid setup and inject some tactical complexity into the game. Instigating a dual threat on the queen's flank, this maneuver forces white to confront immediate pressure and reevaluate their intended piece development. Reclaiming central presence and preparing for a pawn storm by the king's Indian attack setup, this knight maneuver seeks to dislodge the menacing queen and re-establish pressure along the d-file. Liberating the knight from its passive outpost, this maneuver injects dynamism into black's position by immediately contesting the center and creating a fascinating tactical crossroads. Pushing the pawn forward here dramatically alters the pawn structure and initiates a tense struggle for central control, potentially trapping the black knight on c5 or forcing it to retreat. The knight decisively anchors itself on d5, seizing central influence and challenging white's advanced pawn on e5. This establishes a formidable outpost, restricting white's pieces and offering excellent defensive and offensive potential. It also prepares for future pawn pushes and potential breakthroughs, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create weaknesses around the king. Eliminating that nagging knight on d5 directly addresses black's most active piece, simplifying the board and potentially opening lines for white's pieces, while preventing black's queen from finding further influence on the queen side. Reclaiming the d-file, black strategically repositions the attacked rook, initiating a quiet recentralization and preparing to contest crucial lines, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain and eyeing potential pawn breaks later. An ambitious pawn thrust aimed at disrupting black's central structure and potentially creating attacking chances on the king side, but it does leave white's king exposed and could be met with aggressive counterplay. Injecting a knight deep into enemy territory like this, often a desperate measure, now presents white with a challenging dilemma regarding the knight's potential disruption and its vulnerability. Bailing out of the pawn structure complexity with this capture simplifies the position, though it does relinquish the knight's central outpost and opens a path for black's queen. Black recaptures the bishop, initiating a crucial exchange that will dramatically alter the board's complexion and the pawn structure's dynamics. This absorption of white's piece clears the way for black's queen to exert more influence on the queen side and potentially opens lines for future counterplay, though it also surrenders the initiative to white to dictate the tempo. The monarch retreats, seeking refuge behind a freshly constructed pawn shield, a defensive gambit to deny black's knight immediate access to critical central squares. A crucial moment arrives as black shores up the king's safety, a vital precaution given white's menacing piece cluster on the king side and the exposed nature of the dark squares around the monarch. Reigniting the central battle, the knight repositions to a more active outpost. The rook retreats to a more active file, eyeing the d3 square and preparing to exert pressure along the open d-file, simultaneously reinforcing the queenside defensive structure. This advance of the b-pawn, while seemingly modest, subtly begins a process of queenside expansion, aiming to gain crucial territory and perhaps initiate a pawn storm or support a future c5 push later in the game, all while keeping an eye on the long-term potential for a rook lift to the third rank. Unleashing the f-pawn is a bold statement, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for black's rook. However, this pawn push creates a significant weakness on the e6 square, a tempting outpost for white's knights, and also weakens the diagonal leading towards black's king. Consider how this commitment might impact the king's safety in the coming exchanges. The kingside pawn shield, though less critical now, has been irrevocably altered. Unlocking the queenside diagonal, this bishop now eyes the vulnerable king's flank, a strategic pivot aiming to disrupt black's recent pawn advances and create immediate threats. Unifying the bishop and the knight on a central square offers a substantial positional advantage, aiming to exploit the exposed dark squares around white's king. Seeking to connect the rooks and potentially open the d-file, This play aims to activate the queen and challenge black's central control, while implicitly preparing for a potential kingside pawn advance down the line. Demolishing the central pawn chain opens lines for active piece play, but at the cost of creating a potentially vulnerable queen outpost if white can consolidate. A bold assertion of central space is made, immediately challenging the isolated pawn and forcing black to confront a structural dilemma that will shape the middle game, potentially sacrificing material for dynamic counterplay or accepting a compromised pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, black seeks to shatter white's pawn structure and expose the monarch. This aggressive advance immediately questions the king's safety, hinting at potential tactical fireworks. Unleashing a tactical storm. By capturing the pawn, white disrupts black's central pawn chain and opens lines, potentially creating attacking opportunities on the king side. This bold exchange also aims to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's pawn push, forcing a recalculation of defensive resources. Recapturing with the bishop immediately releases the pawn's pressure and opens the e-file, but it also allows white's knight to find refuge on c2, potentially supporting a future advance. The strategic decision here hinges on whether black prioritizes immediate tactical exchanges or aims for a more robust defensive structure. Considering the current pawn structure and the advanced white knight, accepting this capture creates a potentially sharp position where black must be extremely precise to avoid falling victim to a discovered attack or a queenside infiltration. It's a bold choice, embracing chaos for potential counterplay. Asserting dominance on the open d-file is paramount now. This placement aims to challenge black's control and potentially exploit any hesitation in their defense, looking for opportunities to pry open lines towards the king's sanctuary. A bold attempt to disrupt white's queenside pressure by rerouting the queen, hoping to find new attacking avenues and potentially exploit the loose pawn on b3, though it leaves the king potentially exposed to discovered attacks down the d-file if white can capitalize. Challenging black's rook battery on the d-file directly opens up lines and forces a difficult decision regarding piece placement under pressure. Unleashing pressure on the king side, this pawn advance dramatically reopens lines and challenges white's somewhat passive central setup, aiming to disrupt the harmony of black's pieces and potentially create immediate tactical opportunities around the exposed monarch. The bishop's redeployment to c1 aims to reposition it for potential action along the c-file, while also clearing the d-file for the rook, hinting at a desire to contest control of that crucial open lane, perhaps after the f-pawn advances further. A vital consolidation of the monarch, tucking it away behind pawn cover while preparing for potential counterplay. Initiating a flank pawn thrust to disrupt black's kingside cover, aiming to pry open lines for potential attack, while also considering the growing pressure on the d-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, this aggressive pawn advance rips open lines and challenges the defender's structural integrity, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing white to react to a dramatically altered landscape. The queen stepping onto the g-file directly challenges the structural integrity of black's king position, igniting a critical battle for control of this vital open line. Opening the h-file with the rook immediately injects chaos into white's castled position, exploiting the compromised pawn structure around the king that resulted from the earlier pawn pushes. Sacrificing the exchange to shatter black's pawn shield and expose the king is a bold, decisive stroke. Black is desperately trying to salvage a difficult position by sacrificing the bishop for whatever counterplay they can muster, hoping to open lines against white's king. Reasserting control of the central files is paramount, and rerouting the rook to the only open column, even if temporarily, prepares for a coordinated defense and potential counterplay down the e-file. Opening up the dark-squared bishop for its final act, this piece reassumes an active role, aiming to disrupt white's suddenly precarious control of the king's vicinity. A crucial decision point, exchanging queens now before the storm truly breaks, simplifies the ensuing complications and forces black into a potentially exposed king position once the dust settles from this dramatic peace trade. The material is now level, But the shattered pawn structure on white's kingside offers significant long-term weaknesses black can exploit with patient maneuvering and piece activity. Reclaiming the initiative on the queenside becomes paramount as the knight hops to a more active square, aiming to exploit the open lines and the somewhat exposed nature of black's kingside pawn structure after that aggressive pawn push. Black is desperately trying to find counterplay, but this maneuver on the bishop leaves it exposed and potentially out of the game should white manage to consolidate. Securing the rook on an open file, this maneuver finally brings the rook into a more active and centralized position, ready to contest crucial lines and potentially exploit weaknesses in black's setup. Opening the queenside flank now, the black rook aims to pry open lines and create active counterplay against white's somewhat passive structure, potentially targeting that advanced pawn or seeking to establish a presence on an open file. Unlocking the kingside with a bold pawn thrust, white seeks to create immediate threats against the beleaguered black monarch, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for attacking pieces. Finally, the rook swings across, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and leverage the open file. Recapturing the pawn on h3, the king retreats to relative safety, preparing to consolidate the material advantage gained from the exchange sacrifice and assess the newly opened lines. The bishop's daring sortie to e5 after the rook sacrifice creates a fascinating tactical crossroads, forcing white to reevaluate the safety of his king amidst the unleashed storm on the kingside.